At 4:30 in the afternoon on December 9, 1944, Captain James Harlan stood in the ruins of a stone barn 3 miles west of the Saar River, watching snow fall through holes in the roof. The temperature hovered just below freezing. His boots were caked in frozen mud. Outside, the landscape rolled in gentle hills covered in pine forest and scattered farms, most of them now empty or burning. Somewhere in the trees to the east, a German rearguard was dug in, and they had just sent back an American patrol with a message that said, simply, no. The stakes were clear enough. Harlan's company, part of the 95th Infantry Division, was tasked with clearing this sector so the division could continue its push toward the Siegfried Line. Behind him, a regiment waited. Ahead, perhaps 200 German soldiers occupied a fortified position anchored on a manor house and its outbuildings. They had artillery observers, machine gun nests, and at least one anti-tank gun. The German commander, identified by prisoners as a major from a Wehrmacht infantry regiment, had refused the surrender ultimatum delivered 2 hours earlier. He had sent word that he would hold until ordered otherwise by his own command, and that any attack would be met with full resistance. What happened next would not earn anyone a Medal of Honor. There would be no desperate stands, no suicidal charges, no last-ditch artillery barrages called onto friendly positions. Instead, what unfolded over the next 18 hours was something quieter and, in its own way, just as remarkable. A professional siege conducted with patience, restraint, and an almost surgical attention to minimizing casualties on both sides. Even when the enemy had made it clear they intended to fight. James Harlan was 26 years old, 5'10", lean from months on the line. Before the war, he had been a high school mathematics teacher in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and Friday nights meant football games and church socials. He had enlisted in the spring of 1942, received his commission through Officer Candidate School, and arrived in France in late September 1944 as a replacement officer in the 95th Division. By December, he had already seen combat in the Metz campaign, where the division had fought through fortified villages and bunker complexes in some of the ugliest close-quarters fighting of the European War. He had been wounded once, lightly, by shrapnel, and had returned to duty after 4 days. His men trusted him because he was careful, methodical, and because he did not waste lives. The 95th Infantry Division had been activated in 1942 and trained at Camp Swift in Texas. It landed in France in mid-September 1944 and was immediately thrown into the fight for Metz, one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe. The division fought through rain, mud, and entrenched German positions for nearly 2 months before Metz finally fell in late November. By early December, the division was pushing east toward the Saar River and the German border, tasked with clearing scattered German units that had been cut off or left behind as rear guards to delay the American advance. The Germans were a mix of regular Wehrmacht infantry, some Volksgrenadier replacements, and occasional SS units. They were exhausted, outnumbered, and running low on ammunition and fuel, but many still fought with discipline and determination, especially when their officers refused to surrender. The front was cold, wet, and miserable. Soldiers had been on the line for weeks without real rest. Trench foot was epidemic. Replacements arrived daily to fill gaps left by casualties. The weather alternated between freezing rain and light snow, turning roads into rivers of mud and making resupply difficult. Artillery duels were constant. Patrols went out every night and often did not come back. It was the kind of grinding, exhausting warfare that broke units slowly, one day at a time. On the morning of December 9th, Harlan's company had been ordered to advance and clear the manor house position. Reconnaissance patrols reported that the Germans were dug in deep, with interlocking fields of fire and strong points that would be difficult to assault without heavy casualties. The battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel from Pennsylvania, authorized Harlan to attempt a negotiated surrender first. A German-speaking sergeant from the intelligence section was sent forward under a white flag with a typed message in German, offering safe passage and prisoner of war status in exchange for immediate surrender. The sergeant returned an hour later with the major's reply, a polite but firm refusal. Now Harlan stood in the barn with his platoon leaders and the forward artillery observer, a young lieutenant from Iowa, and considered his options. He could order a direct assault, but the terrain favored the defenders, and the cost would be high. He could call in an artillery barrage and flatten the position, but there were reports of French civilians still in the manor house cellars. and division headquarters had made it clear that unnecessary destruction of property and civilian casualties were to be avoided whenever possible. The third option was the one he chose, a slow, methodical encirclement and siege, cutting off the position and making it untenable without a frontal assault. The plan was simple. First, position machine gun teams and mortar sections to suppress any German movement. Second, send squads forward in small groups to establish observation posts within 100 yards of the German perimeter, close enough to call accurate fire but far enough to minimize risk. Third, bring up anti-tank guns to cover the roads and prevent any breakout attempt. Fourth, wait. Give the Germans time to realize their position was hopeless. Offer surrender again at intervals. Apply pressure slowly, methodically, without rushing into a bloodbath. Harlan gave the orders quietly, calmly, the way he had given instructions to students years earlier. Platoon leaders nodded and moved out. Within an hour, the encirclement began. The first phase took 3 hours. Squads moved through the forest in pairs, using the tree line for cover, advancing in short rushes, while others provided overwatch. German sentries spotted them occasionally and opened fire, short bursts from NG-42 machine guns that clattered through the cold air and chewed bark off trees. No one was hit. The Americans did not return fire unless they had a clear target. Instead, they moved carefully, patiently, always taking cover, always waiting for the right moment. By 7 in the evening, as darkness fell, Harlan had observation posts on 3 sides of the manor house, each manned by a sergeant with a radio and a pair of riflemen. The fourth side, facing a frozen stream, was covered by a machine gun team positioned on high ground with a clear field of fire. The manor house itself was a 2-story stone structure with a slate roof, surrounded by a low wall and several outbuildings including a stable, a carriage house, and what had once been a gardener's cottage. Smoke rose from one of the chimneys. Lantern light flickered in a few windows. The Germans had clearly fortified the place. Sandbags were visible around the doors and lower windows, and a machine gun position had been set up in the second-floor corner room with a commanding view of the approach road. Trenches connected the outbuildings. It was a competent defensive setup, the kind built by experienced soldiers who knew their business. Harlan set up his command post in a farmhouse 200 yards west of the manor. He sent word back to battalion that the position was surrounded and that he was prepared to wait. The battalion commander replied with orders to avoid unnecessary casualties and to keep him informed. The artillery observer registered targets on all the outbuildings and approach routes, ready to fire on call, but under strict orders not to engage unless the Germans attempted a breakout or opened fire first. The night was long and cold. Sentries rotated every 2 hours to prevent frostbite. Harlan walked the perimeter twice, checking on his men, making sure they had ammunition and rations, reminding them to stay alert, but not to take unnecessary risks. At one point, a German soldier called out from the manor house, asking in broken English if the Americans had any coffee. One of Harlan's sergeants shouted back that they did, and that if the major changed his mind, there would be hot coffee and warm bunks waiting. There was laughter from both sides, brief and almost surreal, and then silence. At dawn on December 10th, Harlan sent another surrender offer, forward under a white flag. This time the sergeant carried not just a tight message, but also a thermos of hot coffee and a pack of cigarettes as a gesture of professional respect. The major met him at the gate, a tall man in his 40s with a thin face and tired eyes. They spoke for 10 minutes. The major explained that he had orders to hold the position until relieved or until ordered to withdraw by his regimental headquarters, which had not been heard from in 2 days. He asked if the Americans would allow his wounded to be evacuated. Harlan agreed immediately and sent a medic forward with a stretcher team. 3 German soldiers were carried out, all with shrapnel wounds, and were treated by American medics before being sent to the rear. The major thanked them. He still refused to surrender. Harlan tightened the noose. He brought up 2 57mm anti-tank guns and positioned them to cover the main gate and the road leading east. He ordered his mortar teams to fire occasional rounds into the open fields beyond the manor house, not to hit anything but to demonstrate that the position was completely surrounded and that any attempt to escape would be spotted immediately. The Germans responded by sending out a patrol that night, 10 men who tried to slip through the encirclement and reach German lines. They were spotted by an outpost team within 50 yards. The Americans did not fire. Instead, a sergeant called out in German that they were surrounded and that they should return to the manor or come forward and surrender. The patrol hesitated, conferred quietly, and then turned back. No shots were fired. By the afternoon of December 10th, the situation had become a stalemate. The Germans were trapped, but not under direct attack. The Americans were in control, but not pressing the assault. Harlan sent another message, this time offering a 2-hour truce so that both sides could rest and so that the major could reconsider. The major agreed to the truce but still refused to surrender. He sent a message explaining that he was acting under orders and that he would face court-martial if he surrendered without authorization. Harlan understood. He sent word back that he respected the major's position, but that the situation was hopeless and that further resistance would only result in unnecessary deaths. At 4 in the afternoon, a single German artillery shell landed near Harlan's command post, close enough to shatter windows, but far enough that no one was hurt. It was a ranging shot, likely from a German battery miles to the east that had been called in by the observers in the manor house. Harlan had the authority to call in counter-battery fire, and the American artillery observer was ready to flatten the position with high-explosive shells. Harlan considered it. He walked outside and looked at the manor house through his binoculars. He could see soldiers moving behind the sandbags, and he knew there were still French civilians in the cellars. He made the decision not to fire. Instead, he sent one more message. This one was blunt. He explained that if the Germans opened fire again, he would have no choice but to call in a full artillery barrage that would destroy the manor house and everyone in it. He gave the major 1 hour to decide. He asked the major to consider his men, the civilians, and the fact that the war was already lost. He promised fair treatment as prisoners of war, medical care for the wounded, and Red Cross notification of their capture. He signed the message with his name and rank. The hour passed in silence. Harlan stood outside the farmhouse, watching the manor house, waiting. His men were tense, ready, fingers near triggers, but not on them. At 5:15, a white flag appeared in the second-floor window. 10 minutes later, the major walked out through the main gate, alone and unarmed, and met Harlan in the road between the two positions. They spoke briefly. The major explained that his radio operator had finally made contact with regimental headquarters and had been told that the regiment had withdrawn during the night and that all rear guard units were authorized to surrender or withdraw at their own discretion. He said that he was grateful for the restraint shown by the American forces and that he would instruct his men to lay down their arms. Harlan nodded and offered his hand. The major shook it. Over the next 2 hours, 163 German soldiers filed out of the manor house and outbuildings and were taken into custody. They were tired, cold, and relieved. The wounded were treated immediately. The civilians, 11 French villagers, including 4 children, were escorted to safety. The manor house was searched and secured. No American soldiers had been killed or wounded in the entire operation. German casualties were limited to the 3 wounded who had been evacuated the previous day. The silence that followed was heavy with exhaustion and something close to relief. Harlan's men shared rations with the German prisoners. A few spoke in broken German and English, comparing notes on the weather and the war, and how far they all were from home. The major sat on a stone wall near the gate, smoking an American cigarette, and stared at the frozen ground. The battlefield itself was almost untouched. A few mortar craters dotted the fields. Shell casings littered the observation posts. But the manor house stood intact. The trees were still upright, and the roads were passable. It was a small victory, measured not in territory gained or enemies killed, but in lives preserved and destruction avoided. Harlan's company moved out the next morning, continuing the push east. The prisoners were sent to the rear. The manor house was turned over to civil affairs teams, who returned the French civilians to their homes and began arranging for repairs. Within a week, the 95th Division was engaged in heavy fighting along the Siegfried Line, and the siege of the manor house was just another entry in the daily operations log, 4 lines long, noting the capture of 163 enemy personnel with no friendly casualties. James Harlan returned home to Ohio in the summer of 1945. He resumed his teaching position at the high school, married his college sweetheart, and raised 3 children. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he would say that he had been in France and Germany, that he had seen action, and that he had been lucky. He kept his medals in a box in the closet and never displayed them. His students knew he was a veteran, but most did not know the details. He was quiet, methodical, patient, the same qualities that had made him a careful officer. He worked for 32 years as a teacher and then as a vice principal. He coached the math team and volunteered at the local VFW post, helping younger veterans navigate benefits and paperwork. He attended reunions of the 95th Division occasionally, but as the years passed and his health declined, he traveled less. His wife noticed that he sometimes woke at night, sweating and quiet, but he never explained why. He told her once that the hardest part of the war had not been the fighting, but the waiting, the decisions about when to act and when to hold back, knowing that lives depended on every choice. He died in 1998, at the age of 80, in his sleep, in the same small town where he had been born. His obituary in the local paper noted that he had served as a captain in World War II and had been awarded the Bronze Star, but it did not explain what he had done to earn it. His family found his service records and citations after his death, along with a journal he had kept sporadically during the war. In one entry dated December 11, 1944, he had written simply, "Took the manor house yesterday. No one killed. Feel like we did it right." There was no rediscovery, no campaign for a posthumous Medal of Honor, no ceremony at the White House. James Harlan was not a forgotten hero in the traditional sense because what he did was not the kind of action that generates headlines or medal citations. He did not charge a machine gun nest or call fire on his own position or single-handedly save a battalion. Instead, he made a series of careful, patient decisions over the course of 18 hours that resulted in the capture of more than 100 enemy soldiers and the preservation of civilian lives without losing a single man under his command. It was the kind of quiet professionalism that defined much of the American war effort in Europe, the grinding, methodical work of thousands of officers and soldiers who did their jobs with competence and restraint, and then went home and never spoke of it. The 95th Infantry Division compiled one of the most impressive records of any American division in Europe, fighting from the gates of Metz to the Czech border. The division captured more than 30,000 prisoners, liberated dozens of towns and villages, and breached the Siegfried Line in some of the toughest terrain in Germany. It did so with a casualty rate lower than many comparable units, in part because officers like Harlan understood that courage was not just about charging forward but also about knowing when to wait, when to apply pressure, and when to offer a way out. The story of what American soldiers did when a Wehrmacht major refused to surrender is not the story of a single dramatic moment, but rather a pattern repeated across the front in late 1944 and early 1945. It was the story of professional soldiers who understood that the goal was not to kill as many enemies as possible, but to win the war with the minimum necessary violence. It was the story of restraint in the face of provocation, patience in the face of resistance, and humanity in the face of exhaustion and anger. Most of the war was fought by men like James Harlan, ordinary people from small towns and big cities who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and responded with competence, discipline, and quiet decency. They did not seek glory. They did not expect recognition. They did their jobs, came home, and lived the rest of their lives in silence. The war for them was not a single moment of heroism, but a long accumulation of decisions, some made in seconds and some made over hours, each one carrying weight. If you're watching this from somewhere quiet late at night, maybe after a long day, and these stories matter to you, a like or a subscribe quietly tells the algorithm to show them to more people who don't want history to disappear. The manor house still stands today, a private residence in eastern France near the German border. The stone walls bear no plaques. The fields where Harlan's men dug observation posts are now planted with winter wheat. The road where the major surrendered is paved and lined with trees. There is nothing to mark the spot where for 18 hours in December 1944, two groups of men faced each other with weapons ready and chose, as much as war allowed, not to kill. History remembers the great battles and the dramatic stands. It remembers Bastogne and the Bulge and the Bridget Remagen. It should also remember the hundreds of smaller actions where soldiers made the harder choice to wait, to negotiate, to apply just enough force and no more. Those decisions did not make headlines, but they shaped the character of the war and the peace that followed. James Harlan was one of thousands who made those decisions. He was not exceptional, which is precisely the point. He was ordinary, careful, and human. He did his job, saved lives, and then spent the rest of his life teaching algebra to teenagers in a small Ohio town. The war was something that happened to him, not something that defined him. He carried it quietly the way most veterans do, And when he died, the memory of that cold December day went with him. But the choice he made, the patience he showed, the restraint he exercised, those things echo forward. They are part of the reason why the American occupation of Germany was marked more by reconstruction than by revenge, why former enemies became allies, why the post-war order, for all its flaws, was built on something other than pure retribution. If you're still here, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. If you had family who served in World War II, in any army, on any front, share a line or two about them. The comments section is part of how we keep these memories alive. Not just the battles and the medals, but the quiet moments of decision and restraint that defined what kind of war it was and what kind of people fought it. Most of them never asked for recognition. They just did the job and came home. Remembering them doesn't require monuments or ceremonies. It just requires that we take the time to understand what they did and why it mattered. Men like James Harlan won the war one careful decision at a time, and then they disappeared back into ordinary life, leaving behind no trace except the world they helped to build. That world, imperfect as it is, owes them more than it will ever know.